Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanov, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. So today we have invited you to discuss the results of the study, the presentation called Germany in Russian Propaganda in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. So today we're going to have the presentation, and then we'll discuss the summary of the presentation. So let me introduce our guests. Joining us are Yehor Brailian, international journalist, analyst at Detector Media, author of the study. And also joining us is Andrii Dikhtiarenko, journalist, TV presenter, editor-in-chief of Realna Gazeta, Luhansk. And joining us online will be Liubov Rakovytsia, media manager, head of DII-Ukraine civil organization. Thank you for joining us. We can see Ms. Liubov joining us on the screen. So, Mr. Yehor, question to you. Let's discuss the study. Why, first of all, how have you come up with this idea? A little bit about methodology and the results, obviously. Well, good morning. The study was made within the framework of Truth and Justice framework exercised by Berlin, the biggest civil association of Ukrainians living in Berlin. Also among the organizers of the project was the Kiev School of Economy, and it was all funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. The main goal of Truth and Justice project was to join the reserve of misinformation. And last year we had a conference in Berlin during which we were discussing those topics, and basically in spring this year we've published this study, and I was among 4 persons who got the grant for writing this study. So why have I picked this topic? I'm an international journalist. I write on the topics related to EU, NATO, international politics, and after I joined Detector Media, I started writing about the temporarily occupied territories, and I got curious. What is exactly the kind of misinformation the Russians spread about Germany in the temporarily occupied territories? And the methodology of my study was to analyze the Telegram channels and contacted to present the key narratives spread by Russian propaganda in temporarily occupied territories, to characterize the main actors, the people who spread this propaganda, and in the same way to provide certain recommendations for the government of Germany, the government of Ukraine, about what's next, what to do about the strategic communications when it comes to the temporarily occupied territories. On top of that, there are some institutional things. When the Ministry of Reintegration was liquidated and the Ministry of National Unity was established, now we're through this ministry already. I decided to join these 2 perspectives, Germany and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Okay, so let's talk about the results, the narratives that you were able to study, and the actors here that we were able to see as a result of your study. Well, among the key narratives that Russia is spreading in temporarily occupied territories, first of all, is that the sanctions don't work against Russia, that sanctions only harm the German economy, that the Germans want to colonize the territory of Ukraine. There is certain reference to historic circumstances, historic events, and then the misinformation that the military aid coming from Germany only supports the continuation of the war. And another interesting thing, that Russia was actively involving representatives of German minorities living in Crimea, in temporarily occupied territory of Zaporizhia region. And the Russians were trying to involve them in creation of different local authorities, occupational local authorities. And a couple of words about Crimea. Why is it important to mention Crimea and Germans? The Germans have been living in Crimea for a long time. Let's not forget that there were colonist Germans, the Protestants in the south of Ukraine, who were populating the territory of Zaporizhia, Kherson region, Crimea in the end of the century 18, beginning of the century 19, and now Russians are actively involved in different persons of German origin to legitimize their occupation. What do I mean by that? Any pseudo-referendums that Russia was held in March 2014 in Crimea, we can recall the pseudo-referendums in September 2014 in temporarily occupied territories. The Russians tried to get involved different public activists, civil activists of German origin. And let's not forget the youth policy, different youth festivals. For example, in temporarily occupied Luhansk, Russia is inviting foreign students, including students from Germany. And let's not forget it too, that the Germans, just like representatives of other countries, are unfortunately being used by Russia, and it was important to demonstrate that fact for me. When it comes to other actors, I can recall Rodion Miroshnik, who back in his day was the head of Luhansk Regional Broadcasting Company. Then he betrayed Ukraine, and his current position is the special representative of MFA of Russian Federation in crimes of Ukrainian regime. So he is said to be monitoring the war crimes committed by the armed forces of Ukraine. He had been addressing United Nations back in his day, and he was outspoken in relation of different German officials like Annalena Baerbock and Olaf Scholz. So basically, there are actors who act at the all-Russian level, and among other actors, there were leaders of German community in Crimea and in temporarily occupied part of Zaporizhia region. We know that Germany is a strategic partner for us. They provide a lot of military aid to us and other kinds of aid. So how is that interpreted in temporarily occupied territories? Well, obviously it's being construed in a negative way. Russia was actively stating that the German Nazis are arming Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Obviously, the neo-Nazi narrative is one of the key narratives in Russian propaganda. They will keep mentioning Germany frequently in the context of Crimean Bridge. If Germany provides the weapons to Ukraine that will allow Ukraine to destroy that bridge, Russia will resort to some activities on their end. So let's not forget that the Russians monitor every single interview of Western politicians, and the German politicians are no exception. Russian propaganda in temporarily occupied territories just tears a phrase, tears a statement out of the context, and they present it as if the weapons are only continuing the war. That's one of the key narratives that they spread in the temporarily occupied territories. And on top of that, they say that it's Germany who's said to be bombing Donbass and other narratives that we remember since 2015. And I would like to add, Yehor, if you allow, you were right to mention that the propaganda is very intense in using the narratives of the victory in World War II. And basically, the key opponent for the USSR was Germany. And the Russian Federation considers themselves to be heirs of Soviet Union. And every time Germany supplies weapons, this information is being intensified in this echo chamber. When Leopard tanks were provided, and we were tracking it in the Telegram channels spread in temporarily occupied territories, you know, this hunting of German Leopard was presented almost as a key statement, and there were parallels made with World War II. There were Tiger and Panther tanks back in the day. There were special programs on TV dedicated to it. we mostly monitor Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and when it comes to their television, there were pseudo-historical shows that were providing those examples. Like back in that day, we were fighting Europe that was united by Hitler, and now we continue fighting the same Europe, and the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, they inherited that Nazism from the old Nazism. So the topic of Germany is a trigger for the propaganda in the temporarily occupied territories, because it's difficult to explain why are you fighting democratic countries. But if you approach it through the historic myth, like Taurus, if it's provided, it will be definitely played through the prism of this historic myth. Well, we understand that Russian propaganda works against all of the countries, and obviously Ukraine is among the top ones, but it touches upon our partners too. So when it comes to Germans' share, for our understanding, what's Germans' share in the propaganda? Well, I think that Germany takes third or fourth place after United States and Great Britain when it comes to the number of mentionings. The Anglo-Saxons and the vile Germans are the main antagonists for Russian propaganda. And I would segregate it. There are separate statements made by Russian propaganda specifically about Germany and everything related to German foreign policy and support of Ukraine, and in the same way it applies to the Germans who live in temporarily occupied territories. And again, it raises a question. And the third narrative is the way the Germans are being used in this legitimization of Russian occupation. And there is also the fourth dimension, which is connected to the third one, the way the German journalists were visiting the temporarily occupied territories. We remember a German journalist visiting occupied Mariupol in the beginning of 2024. He was telling the stories of reconstruction there. So again, let's not forget it too. The question is only about the way we communicated with the German party. Well, unfortunately, we have to recognize that Russians are working with the narratives in a very well-targeted manner, and they know how to transform them. Have you been observing any transformation of narratives, say, comparing to the year 2022, the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and now? Well, I can add a little bit. The government was changing in Germany too. There were elections held, and in the beginning of the war, I mean the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we'll remember to what extent or how unsure the position of Germany was when it was coming to the handover of weapons. There were different statements meant, and I was thinking, if we analyze Russian propaganda, that within the first years of the full-scale invasion, they didn't want to quarrel with Germany because they were hoping the German government would take a moderate position in terms of support of Ukraine, specifically the military aid, and the least expectations the Russians had, the more anti-American narratives were emerging in those anti-Western platforms. I've already demonstrated the example with Leopard, and there was a wave of hate about Taurus, and obviously when the new chancellor has headed Germany, the Chancellor Merz, after Olaf Scholz. So there was the wave of hate against Mr. Merz. They were mentioning his ancestors who were taking part in the war. So that's like a mandatory thing. Germany, first of all, the key narrative is that they were a theoretic ally with whom Putin worked personally back from the days of Schröder. that was a country to which Russia was building Nord Stream to, and there were some sentiments by Russian propaganda, maybe even something related to Kremlin, something originating from Kremlin, trying to deter the Germans, not to expose them as the enemy, but then they unfolded, so to say, all of those narratives, like the Germans are the descendants of Hitler. And such narratives are becoming bigger and bigger. Mr. Liubov, I would like to get you joined to our conversation. You work a lot with the temporarily occupied territories. You understand the situation there. Can you please provide your comments on that?
Yes, I think this conversation is interesting, and I would like also to mention that the Russian propaganda is working collegially on the territories that are occupied by the Russian army at the moment. And as you can see, even in the better days for us, their main narratives that they're using on the occupied territories and their activity, all types of different characters, individuals that they are using basically on the territories that they are occupying right now. It shows that they are paying a lot of attention to the propaganda itself. And as to how we are supposed to respond to that is a difficult question, because we are limited in our resources as opposed to the Russian Federation, especially right now when the war is still raging. Even if we're talking about describing how the partners of Ukraine are acting on the international level, we could say that the relations are getting colder, so to speak, because of certain tiredness of our partners with this war, which was also another narrative that was used by Russian Federation. And so within this framework, we are also exercising efforts towards engaging our international partners as much as possible in not only in military aid, but also in information security. And while we are working with our international partners, I would like to mention that we are receiving all kinds of help from our partners, for which we are grateful. And we are hoping that this will keep happening in the future. And I would like to also express my gratitude for the understanding that was shown by our partners in these difficult times for Ukraine. And we are also, I would like to emphasize that we keep being very open about our work, and we are always ready to listen to any kind of information that's out there and could show how or in what direction the Russian Federation is using their power in the information domain. We have to understand that the enemy that we are facing right now is very, very serious. Thank you. Yes, we do agree that the situation is getting worse, especially also with propaganda, and that's why I think it's important to talk about us. What is going on with the media today, how this topic of the occupied territories is being given in the media. I will shortly say that the Detector media has a separate section, collaborators, and it's dedicated to the traitors of Ukraine among the journalists. And it wasn't purely our invention. It was a result of analysis and cooperation with the British media company, and we were monitoring a portion of Luhansk region, and thanks to Andrii and Valentyna Troian, to Alexander Bilokobilsky, I managed to learn about the situation in Lugansk region much more, and we are conducting all kinds of studies in the occupied territories, not only the one that we're talking today here. However, one of the key questions that is remaining and should be remaining on the state level is the communication with our partners. Andrii, is it a subjective opinion, or is the topic of our war with Russia is losing its glitter in the English media? Why do you think so? Well, there is less publications. We objectively don't have any access to this. Well, this is a big topic, and I am ready to talk about it for hours. However, as of right now, a main factor is, I think, that less and less sources report about the changes in the war in the front lines, and also we here are observing perturbations in the ministries, the summer heat, other important events in the political life, and also we have these different analytical centers that are in charge of different governmental institutions. And so the functions were separated between the Ministry of the Unity and the Ministry of Regional Development. However, we had some more reforms to those institutions, and so it turns out that the studies that were conducted regarding the situation on the occupied territories is in shambles right now, and we don't know who to refer to. Nobody can tell us where we should go or who to ask. And so the regional media, like for example, Realna newspaper, Noviny Donbassa, like ours, they keep systematically give information about this war. Other specialized media, I think they are not worth paying attention to. And if we don't have monitoring on the level of government, and please don't think that if we don't have any kind of a statewide policy about resistance to the informational war, against Ukraine from the Russian Federation, we do have private organizations, smaller private organizations like us. Look at us, observe us. I think we are showing results, and my colleagues keep monitoring Telegram channels, not only here in Kiev, but also in occupied territories. Yes, I think that what we don't hear often enough is regions. Ms. Liubov, if maybe you have something to add. Yes, indeed. We are also working a lot we can actually see from the start of the war that however, the presence of the state in the governmental affairs, starting from the start of the war and up till now, is mostly invisible and intangible. So it exists, but it's not organized. It's not arranged in a appropriate manner, and all those connections that were broken and then created again and then broken again, they are recreated again, and this happens between the territories, between our territories and the territories that are occupied. And these things are happening without being controlled. And Russia is always using these opportunities to play their hand, so to speak. And because despite anything that might happen, those agendas that the Russian Federation is pushing all around the world, we cannot just let them slide. We need to actively oppose them, because their propaganda is working, and it has been proven time and time again. And what we have also seen is the reverse cooperation between the occupied territories and the territories of Ukraine, and some agents basically mixing with the local population. And these threats to the to the national security it needs to be understood that the people who lived their whole lives there, who grew up there, who went to schools over there, that they are happy to any kind of positive dynamics in this situation that we are seeing currently on the occupied territories. And so the information about this study, about other studies that are being conducted in the domain of information influence is very important. So, thank you very much. We indeed understand that despite anything, the state has to be involved in all the questions that arise during the studies like these. So let's stop on these topics, the topics of the state. So if we're talking about the, for example, our ministry is in the state of transformation, and these transformations will probably finish soon. So which steps have to be done in order to effectively counteract the influence of Russia? Well, it's a coordination, first of all, and there's a lot of different bodies that are in charge of strategic command. However, there is not as much organizations that are capable of effective coordination between them, among themselves. So the second question would be the economical development, political, humanitarian development. I think we still don't have this strategic vision of how we, for example, are seeing the occupied territories of the Crimea, of the Donetsk region, of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and other oblasts. We don't really have this common vision. We don't, and it's not. It does not have its distinctive features. So I think the civil society, the journalists, accomplished a lot of work during these last 17 years. And especially the first independent journalists. I remember at the time of the. Of those changes, of those big changes, the big question was how active people really know each other. And so the question is basically how all these active people can influence the government and how it can be fruitful, you know. So we had special studies for that, and I also took part in it, and there is all the steps that need to be undertaken to accomplish what you have asked. However, there is also a question of how we approach to the question of the collaboration with the enemy. I think that a huge accent has to be put on the humanitarian component. I know that we have a Ukrainian German commission that are kind of proactively study this question. However, we cannot really understand what was happening on those territories, including those southern territories of Ukraine during the World War II, without the opinions from the German part. And the informational landscape was forming over there for a few decades. And what Liubov has said, that everybody is doing their own thing, and forums, organizing forums, media. The question is how exactly it's affecting the future of the strategic communication of the Ukrainian government with its international partners. I will add not so much. Let's not forget that we need to communicate with the people on the occupied territories. They are Ukrainians and they are suffering, and the independent media, unfortunately, is only making it, doing it as a their own volunteer thing, and they're making joint organizations and are creating risks, undergoing risks, which includes technical, social components, YouTube, other social platforms. Like, for example, not so long ago, it was announced that a new messenger Max will be implemented, and which is basically a WeChat, when they want to squeeze in all the social lives into this messenger, and we don't know how exactly we're going to communicate with those territories if this happens. So we will be looking for the answer by ourselves, and we will find it. And the main question right now is to understand on which level we have to communicate. Like, for example, a TikTok has been published not so long ago, and we understand that the Russians are working constantly on pushing their propaganda, and as we can see, we really do need any kind of support that could be provided by the government, and we are ready to work too. Liubov.
What are the steps that the civil organization are still in need to see on part of the government? Well, when it comes to the support of the United States, it's a matter of demand for certain activities, because quite frequently it may seem that you're doing a lot, but on the other hand, you understand that it may not resolve the situation on a systemic level. So we try to cooperate with the Ministry of Culture and Strategic Communications in its transformed way, but nevertheless we try to continue fulfilling our tasks. I think it's really important what we do when we try to influence the minds of the people so they take a different stance. And yes, we have to join our efforts, but also to influence the state in certain ways so that they express themselves more, so to say, in this kind of fight. Sometimes there is an impression that when it comes to occupied territories, any concerns of them are not timely, and there is no resources to be allocated to support them in this information front. And now we are kind of sensitive to different types of topic, and what we would like to see is the state working on uniting Ukrainians. And this is exactly what we want to advise to the state. Yes, and we have to do our own thing. Meanwhile, we have our mission. We know how to do our thing. But still, we're a state, a unitary state. And yes, we have to stick together. Thank you very much, dear friends. If we have any questions on the floor, please let us know. I would like to add real shortly what needs to be done is to create a database in which both Ukrainian and foreign journalists will be able to find more information about temporarily occupied territories. When it comes to the media, there is the list of regional media published by Detector Media and the Institute of Mass Information. It's posted on the website of Detector Media Plus. There is the Center of Information Support in the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. They make the same kind of studies. They published the studies about the situation in the temporarily occupied territories twice a year. So on top of the regional media and the Center for Information Resistance, there are different civil organizations. So the people who would like to find out more, for example, I can show you a personal example. I was approached by the scientist from Germany twice who read the study, and one student from her school, a student of politology from Brailian, she said she got curious about the topic of temporarily occupied territories, and basically in the same way, if it sparks more interest in the foreign scientists, they first of all need to know where to get that information. Well, you've touched upon an important topic, exactly what I would like to discuss. Our teamwork with the foreign colleagues and our work with the foreign audience. I mean, when it comes to technical issues, we have access to those audiences. The access is easier than to the temporarily occupied territories. So what that work should look like? What should we intensify to make sure that our narratives prevail over the Kremlin's narratives? Well, let me be brief here. I think we know how to sell our victories. Let's take an example of the Black Sea and the fact that the armed forces of Ukraine, the security and defense forces of Ukraine, were able to destroy like half of the Black Sea fleet of Russia. And it's not been extensively covered in the foreign media. Well, it's not like it's not been extensively covered, but it's not been emphasized. And it may be one of the examples that we have something to take pride in. We have things to tell about. And again, when it comes to history and culture, it may be interesting to more of a broad audience and maybe interesting to foreign audience. Well, let me give you an example. I think there was a German initiative and OST, and in cooperation with the Public Interest Laboratory, they've made a project. They've invited foreign journalists. They've made the training for them. I was reading a lecture about the temporarily occupied territories. They were telling about the temporarily occupied territories, and based on my experience of cooperation with those foreign journalists, I've realized that our country needs to be explained what's going on in temporarily occupied territories, that people suffer there. The fact that people are forced to take the Russian passport doesn't mean they support Russian Federation, because without the Russian passport you won't be able to get any medical services, any services whatsoever, because the occupiers, they exercise intense pressure, and it should be explained. The stories of the people from temporarily occupied territories should be told. All those sufferings should be broadcasted, because Russia is very active in the work related to distortion of what's going on in occupation. They keep rebuilding Mariupol. They built new housing. Everything's fine. The people who are suffering, the Ukrainians who have been persecuted there, they've been put in the cellars. They've been killed quite frequently. The children are being taken away from their parents and brought to re-education camps thousands of kilometers away from their parents. It's happening right now as we're talking. And what we see is only the tip of the iceberg. So we have to tell the world those stories too. We have to say that Ukrainians in occupation, Ukraine in occupation is still Ukraine. There are millions of people suffering. They need to be helped. They need to get information support, and the foreign media should be involved in this work, because there's a lot of horrible but at the same time interesting stories going on. Thank you very much. We have a question from the floor.
In English, if it's okay. I wanted to ask you, do you see any parallels between the propaganda in Germany and in the occupied territories? Are there narratives that maybe are similar?
Yeah, I can see a lot of things in common, because if we study the Russian propaganda spread in Germany specifically, Russia is trying to use different fears, and the fact that Russia invested a lot of resources. I can say it as historian, the understanding of history and the fact that the modern Germans feel some guilt in front of the Russians for the World War II. That's the consequence of Soviet propaganda and the modern Russian propaganda too. I think that the difference is that in temporarily occupied territories, the Russians are using some local specifics. For example, there is such a person, Yuri Hempel. He's the head of the German community in temporarily occupied Crimea, and he was openly stating in March 2024 that if Germany provides the Taurus missiles to Ukraine, he was talking to Russian officials back then. So in that case, Russian Federation would denounce 2+4 agreement, the agreement in compliance with which Germany got united back in 1990. And then the question arises, on part of Germany, Merz started talking about Russian propaganda, but nevertheless, Russia and Germany is still using the existing divisions, like the issues of migrants, the issues of attitude to Ukraine, and a lot of other topics. So Russia is not creating those divisions, those problems in the German society, but they scale them up, and this is the essence of the problem, in my opinion. Let me add a little bit. I think back in 2018, it was my first time in Berlin. I came to Alexanderplatz, and I've seen the manifestation to support DPR and LPR. Russian-speaking Germans were singing Soviet songs. They were unfolding those flags, and to me it was an important marker of how easy and free the Russian organizations feel themselves in Germany. I'm not aware of any such manifestations in temporarily occupied territories. We were studying this matter. We were studying the sample books of what is told in the temporarily occupied territories, the key narratives, the instructions the experts have to communicate. And it's easy to understand that in the same centralized and massive way, Russian propaganda is acting outside, including in Germany. But it's a matter of how loyal the population of Ukraine is taking those expressions of propaganda. I think that there were times when Germany had quite a high percentage of pro-Russian population. Obviously, there's a lot of post-Soviet immigrants with whom Russian propaganda works as well. By the way, I've just recalled another narrative that was actively used in propaganda in temporarily occupied territories. It's related to Germany. It's about the so-called German Cossacks, that there are Russian Cossacks in Germany. There is some Cossack phalanx, And those Germans, well, apparently the immigrants from post-Soviet space, and yeah, they were actively supporting DPR and LPR. You know, this transition of narratives from Kremlin to occupied territories and then to some groups of influence abroad, well, it's going on a continuous basis, and it's a very good question. We have to keep track of those patterns because us in Realna Gazeta, we always keep track of how the Russian central narratives are evolving in temporarily occupied territories. If we have other narratives covered that are being spread in the West, well, that would be even more interesting. Well, I would like to thank you for this wonderful conversation. I would like to thank all of the journalists, all of the civil organizations who cover the topic of temporarily occupied territories, who cover this matter. Obviously, I would like to thank our armed forces for this opportunity to gather and discuss those topics. Thanks, everybody, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.